I'm AJ DeBonis, and welcome to Interfaith Matters. In this episode, we talk with Elizabeth Platt, who is the director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School. The Law, Rights, and Religion Project is a think tank dedicated to addressing the complexities of religious liberty in the United States. They strive to promote social justice, freedom of religion, and religious plurality, with a particular focus on how religious liberty rights interact with other fundamental rights. Liz and I talk about the influence of the Christian right, free exercise claims, and religious accommodations, and the principles necessary for protecting religious freedom, not merely for a favored few, but for everyone. Liz, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so the first question I have, maybe you can just tell me about the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School. When was it started? Why was it started? And what's the primary work that you do?
Yeah, so the Law, Rights, and Religion Project, or LRRP, was started in 2014. And it was started as really a think tank primarily to address the rising number of lawsuits and bills and policies we were seeing that were demanding a right to religious carve-outs, primarily from reproductive health and LGBTQ rights laws. So this was a month before the Hobby Lobby decision came down. This was the year before Obergefell found the constitutional right to marriage equality for same-sex couples. And so the work really initiated as sort of an LGBTQ rights and a reproductive justice organization. I would say since that time, I think we've really grown to appreciate how a lot of these religious exemption policy proposals also actually harm not just reproductive and LGBTQ rights, but really harm religious liberty itself, which is, I think, something we'll get into. And so by kind of not representing all religious communities and elevating the religious beliefs of particular religious communities. So I think that really caused our mission to shift a little bit, such that I now see LRRP as primarily a religious liberty organization that also values these other fundamental rights. And in terms of kind of the nuts and bolts of what we do, we weigh in on a whole range of law and policy issues by writing reports. We conduct original research, submit amicus briefs, issue analyses of proposals, things like that.
Yeah, you've published two major reports in the last couple of years. So one was entitled Whose Faith Matters? The Fight for Religious Liberty Beyond the Christian Right in 2019, and another, All Faiths and None, A Guide to Protecting Religious Liberty for Everyone, that came out a few months ago in October of 2020. And listeners, you can find both of those reports at the LRRP website. Could you just give us a brief summary of each of those reports and, what the impetus was behind them and what's contained in them?
Yeah, absolutely. So Whose Faith Matters gives, I would say, a pretty sweeping overview of humanitarian and social justice movements that have fought for the right to free exercise. So it includes a really broad kind of range of religious actors and groups. So everyone from members of the sanctuary movement of the 1980s who felt that they had a deep religious obligation to provide assistance to migrants crossing over into the United States, to the clergy consultation service, which were folks providing information about access to safe abortion in the years prior to Roe v. Wade, and again, did this out of a deep sense of religious obligation. To contemporary lawsuits involving Native American groups protecting sacred land from environmental degradation. So it really went through just a whole bunch of different issues. And a primary impetus, I would say, of the report was to push back against a narrative that I've really seen that social justice groups or the left really is somehow anti-faith or doesn't support religious liberty. And we wanted to show that this was completely false, and that in fact, the progressive groups and movements have been very deeply involved in the fight for religious expression, but just with a kind of different vision of what that meant and what religious liberty meant. And the other report you mentioned, All Faiths and None, which I want to note that we co-wrote with the amazing folks at Auburn Seminary, that builds off a lot of the kind of thinking that we initiated in Whose Faith Matters. And it lays out a set of principles for going forward, how we might protect religious liberty, for very broadly for everyone, essentially. And that includes the religious rights of non-religious and atheist folks. So how we protect religious liberty in the pluralistic society in which we live.
You kind of mentioned this, but the first report, the Whose Faith Matters report, argues that religious liberty has been framed in recent years primarily as a concern of the religious right in the United States, and particularly by conservative Christians with regard to the two issues you kind of mentioned were reproductive rights and marriage equality and LGBTQ issues. So one immediately, like you said, thinks of, to me, these are kind of the most high profile religion cases in the past 10 years that immediately come to mind are Burwell versus Hobby Lobby in 2014, and then Masterpiece Cake Shop in 2018. And like you said, this narrative of religious liberty, and the reason it seems worth broadening is that it can have the effect of kind of equating religiosity with conservatism and a more liberal approach to social issues with irreligion. So it seems to me like a kind of collapsing of the complex identities of people with these diverse value commitments and religious affiliations. So I have two questions, but I'll keep them separate, and I'll just give you the first one. Why do you think that's become the dominant narrative of religious liberty in the United States? Why have these particular cases gained so much ground in the past 10 years? And I think for a lot of people, those are maybe the cases that come to mind when they think about religion in the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yeah, I think it's become the dominant narrative because there have been a range of actors who have invested a huge amount of resources into making it the dominant narrative. So there are dozens of very well-funded Christian right law and policy organizations, Alliance Defending Freedom, American Center for Law and Justice, Family Research Council, I could go on for a long time. I won't. But there have been a huge number of groups that have made it their mission to advance this understanding of religious liberty. And I think they've really been extremely successful. So, there was actually just a couple weeks ago, there was a recent survey that was issued by the CAP, the Center for American Progress, that looked at media coverage of LGBTQ issues and found that even though the majority of people of faith actually support LGBTQ equality rights, I think it was 2/3 of the folks quoted in articles about LGBTQ issues and religion were opposed to anti-discrimination protections. So they've had a bunch of success capturing the narrative, and like you said, the Christian right has also been, I think, very organized and dedicated in at introducing very high-profile lawsuits, hundreds of lawsuits related to LGBTQ rights, the ACA contraceptive mandate, and most recently church challenges to COVID restrictions, actually. So, very, very large litigation campaigns and a huge number of religious exemption bills, particularly at the state level, and following, actually a legislative playbook that was created called Project Blitz that has a whole list of model religious exemptions and other model legislation on these issues. So, I think that wave of litigation and wave of state laws that have been proposed has also really helped kind of capture and shape the narrative about religious liberty, as opposed to religious liberty issues that just haven't had the bandwidth to get, the groups haven't had the bandwidth to get to capture the public attention in that way when it comes to lawsuits, for example, about the Native Americans who want to use eagle feathers as part of religious ceremonies, something like that.
This is kind of part of my follow-up question, but to sort of redress that public perception, can you give us some examples of maybe some higher profile religious liberty cases, or even, things that might not come to many people's immediate attention or minds in recent years that have been taken up by plaintiffs who, we might typically construe as more progressive leaning?
Yeah, I think a couple cases that I think are really notable and interesting are cases involving volunteers with the group No More Deaths in Tucson, Arizona. There were some volunteers who were arrested a few years ago now for providing food and water to migrants crossing the desert who were at risk of dehydration, and were criminally prosecuted for those acts. And part of their defense was that they were engaged, providing this food and water was a part of their religious activities, and should, the federal government therefore had to respect that practice and accommodate it. And they brought this defense based on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is actually the same law that was at issue in Hobby Lobby. And they actually won some of those cases. So there were, I believe, 5 in total volunteers who actually had their misdemeanor cases dismissed because it was a religious practice. But there have been a bunch. There have been a couple one I would say interfaith nonprofit that sought to open a safe injection site for drug users as an exercise of their religious practice. There was a case involving some lay Catholics who performed a ceremony at a U.S. nuclear military facility as an exercise of their faith, and they performed a ceremony involving dumping out vials of their own blood to protest nuclear weapons, and were arrested and brought a religious liberty defense. There have also been some really interesting recent lawsuits brought by members of the Satanic Temple who have argued, and actually some of this litigation is still ongoing, have argued that state level restrictions on abortion access interfere with their members' religious beliefs and practices, including a belief in bodily autonomy. So there are a bunch, and I would definitely encourage folks interested in this to go ahead and read our Whose Faith Matters report.
You also have on your website the guide for the media. Can you talk a little bit about that? It seems like this was a separate piece that was kind of put together for the sake of educating journalists and people who are covering these issues for the sake of, again, like redressing this kind of monolithic narrative that we had been talking about beforehand.
Yeah, I was really excited about that project. So it's, I think we're in a bit, we might talk about some of the themes that we drew out about religious liberty in our All Faiths and None report, but the media guide was really intended to kind of distill those themes articulated in this very lengthy report down to something kind of immediately digestible and useful for journalists covering religious liberty issues, which we acknowledge, are very difficult and can be quite confusing. So, I think it's my hope is that the media guide just provides some food for thought for how to, distill questions on a really complicated topic in a way that, doesn't essentialize religious liberty as something belonging to the Christian right. So, for example, we have some model questions about particular issues. So, for a journalist who may be writing on the intersection of reproductive rights and religion, and who has really only heard about religious exemptions as religious communities who are against abortion rights, we encourage to think through, well, what are the religious questions that are affecting sort of all actors and parties in a particular scenario? So what are the religious beliefs of the patient seeking an abortion? What are the religious beliefs of a hospital? What are the religious beliefs of a doctor who, you know, may disagree with the rules of their hospital. So that's sort of the idea of the media guide.
The Whose Faith Matters report states, and this is a quote, many of the religious exemption proposals advanced by the right do not actually protect religious liberty, but rather advance the cause of conservative Christian hegemony. Can you give any examples of how recent legislative proposals have maybe favored conservative Christians, but not provided for equal treatment of analogous claims by other religious groups?
Yeah, so I can give a few examples of this. There are, you know, a huge number of state and federal policies intended to protect medical providers that object to certain types of reproductive health care, and in particular, abortion and sterilization, as we've sort of been discussing. There are relatively few protections for medical providers who believe that they actually have a religious obligation to provide their patients with comprehensive medical care, including reproductive health care. So, you know, how does this kind of work in practice? Um, a religious doctor in general has the right to opt out of abortion care, even if they work at a hospital that's sponsored by a religious denomination that supports reproductive rights. So let's say they work at a Jewish hospital, they still have the option to opt out of abortion care. If you flip that, and you have a doctor whose faith requires her, let's say, to provide comprehensive reproductive health care or provide the standard of care um, that her patient wants, she can get fired for providing an abortion or even a referral for abortion if she works at a Catholic hospital. So the protections are pretty imbalanced, and the legal system overall is essentially favoring anti-abortion religious beliefs. And I want to emphasize that this isn't kind of some like a imaginary legal analysis that I sort of made up for, like a law school like hypothesis. You know, we know that from studies that there are doctors who have objections to their hospital's restrictive policies on reproductive health care, and that would provide care if they could. Um, and I'd say another example, you know, again, is the kind of current debate over the Equality Act, the bill being debated in Congress now that would extend anti-discrimination protections to, among other things, would extend them to LGBTQ people in the workplace. Um, I think, again, the way that this often gets framed and the way I think folks some Christian right groups have tried to frame it is, you know, this debate push and pull between LGBTQ equality and religious liberty. But I think that framework really only works if you consider the religious rights of the employer as the only ones that matter, and you sort of ignore the religious liberty rights of the workers. So right now, under our Civil Rights Act, employers actually have to accommodate the religious liberty, the faith practices of their workers. So not only can an employer not, you know, tell their workers where to go to church or how to practice their religion, if one of their workers needs a religious accommodation to practice their faith, they actually have to give it to the worker. Creating a really big religious exemption geared towards employers would actually flip that, such that employees could now be essentially subject to religious criteria, specifically religious criteria related to sex, gender, and marriage from their employers. So it's really confusing to me why there would, you know, why we would be, you know, extending religious rights specifically to employers in the context of a workers' rights bill, which is the Civil Rights Act. Um, and uh, and then, you know, finally, like I talked about, you know, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, and again, I would say like just the overall kind of intense focus on exemptions in these areas is a way in which we just elevate the concerns of conservative Christians, you know, above other groups. So it's kind of more broadly.
You mentioned there do seem to be these scenarios where the free exercise of religion can conflict with other civil rights. I wonder, this seems like a kind of, I don't know, tragedy of the commons is maybe not the right phrase, but a sort of dilemma that's obviously very hard to kind of sort through. Are there any sort of weighted considerations that you can offer in sorting through these seemingly mutually conflicting claims that pose limits to religious liberty, or where religious liberty seems to come into conflict with other civil rights? How is it at all possible to exercise neutrality in cases where you have these two mutually conflicting rights kind of coming against one another? Or is that a bad way of framing it? Is that sort of like part of the problem, maybe?
Um, I think lawyers often will kind of complain that a particular area of the law is like totally incoherent and there's so many different tests and it's really confusing. Uh, and that's certainly true to some extent. But I don't think it's really possible to come up with like a perfect way to, a perfect test or way to weigh all these things. And so, what we have done at LRP is at least try to come up with um, some sort of overlapping standards and guidelines that can help sort through these kinds of conflicts, and that's essentially the 6 themes that we laid out in our all faiths and none report. But one other sort of I think way to think about it that can be helpful is thinking about a standard based in the idea of third party harm. That free exercise rights can't be granted at the clear expense of another person's legal or constitutional rights, because then that person's religious liberty is actually being violated, not just their equality rights, not just their reproductive rights or whatever. They're, by being essentially required to subsidize someone else's religion, their religious liberty rights themselves are being violated. So, I think one really clear example, and it won't always be this clear, obviously, but one really clear example that I think is really helpful in kind of explaining this is there have actually been a couple lawsuits in which one spouse has argued that their religious beliefs forbid divorce. And so that if a state were to grant their spouse, like the other spouse, a divorce, that would violate their religious liberty rights. But of course, if a state did that, if the state refused to grant an otherwise perfectly legal divorce, then they'd be violating the religious rights of the other spouse. So, religious accommodations do have to yield when they amount to essentially imposing, the costs of one person's religious practice on the other person's religious practice. So, that's that third party harm, I think, principle can be really useful across like a whole range of settings. In terms of like the neutrality piece, obviously judges are human. Like we're not going to get to perfect neutrality, I think, but I would say the imbalance right now is just like kind of outrageous. I mean, we have, for example, like in Masterpiece Cake Shop, the court doing this extremely searching review of the history to find that Jack Phillips, the baker in that case, who didn't want to offer a cake to a same-sex couple, there's this very searching review to find evidence that the state was discriminating against him, and therefore to throw out the case. You have just a couple weeks later, and the court refuses to even consider the ample evidence of religious animus motivating the Muslim ban. So, is it possible to get to neutrality? Again, they're fallible, they're human, but I think we certainly should expect a whole lot better than what we're seeing now.
So you mentioned the all faiths and none report and the kind of guiding principles that you use to, try to bring justice, I guess, to the issue of religious liberty. You mentioned these 6 principles: that religious liberty should be neutral, non-coercive, non-discriminatory, non-absolute, democratic, and pluralistic. And essentially, this is framed This is another quote from the report in trying to offer guidance on how a future presidential administration could protect religious freedom, not merely for a favored few, but for everyone. So this might take a little bit of time, and we can kind of go through these one by one if you're willing to. But could you sort of take us through each of these principles and give maybe a suggestion or two for how they could be achieved?
Yeah, definitely. I'd be happy to take us through the 6 principles, and I'll try to be punchy about it. So the first one, as you mentioned, is neutrality, and I think honestly, this is first, and it's really the foundation of religion law. Both the free exercise clause and the establishment clause, these two religion clauses of the First Amendment that ideally work together. Um, Both require the government not to take sides when it comes to religious beliefs or religious communities, and again, that always includes the non-religious. So, the neutrality principle would demand, for example, that we get rid of policies that target Muslims. So things like the CARP, the Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program, which is a covert program that essentially denies immigration status to certain groups of people who are almost exclusively Muslim. The neutrality principle would also bar, policies that essentially enact a preference for particular religious views, like the scenario, I discussed earlier, with where the legal scheme often favors anti-abortion over pro-choice religious healthcare providers. The second principle we talk about is that religious liberty should be non-coercive. The kind of point of religious liberty protections are to protect, every individual's freedom of conscience. And so we don't think that folks should be, legally coerced into following a particular religious doctrine. And so obviously, I think this is most clearly violated when we're talking about things like proselytization within an explicitly government institution, within a public school or within the military, things like that. I also don't think that we should be seeing, proselytization within government-sponsored and programs. So things like, an entirely government-funded health clinic, things like that. Then I would also say that that non-coercion principle is violated for when the government, creates these exemptions that that violate that third-party harm principle I spoke about earlier, and that essentially require one person to subsidize religious beliefs that they don't believe in themselves. The third principle we talk about is that religious liberty must be non-discriminatory. So despite some of the rhetoric that we're hearing, specifically around like the Equality Act, I think the reality is that anti-discrimination law is really good for religious liberty. It's actually essential for religious liberty. So civil rights laws, that we've had on the books for many decades, have allowed religious minorities in particular to participate in the public sphere without fear of losing their job or losing their house. So while like a religious exemption that might allow, Jack Phillips or another baker to refuse services to a same-sex couple, or refuse to bake a wedding cake for an atheist couple or a Jewish couple, that kind of religious exemption, may benefit that bakery owner. But overall, we think that those kinds of religious exemptions actually chill religious practice, because, folks might be chilled in exercising their religion if they know they might be denied services or a job, if it's known that they're an atheist or a Jew or a Muslim, and they increase religious balkanization, and they're just overall not a good thing for religious liberty and for pluralism. So the fourth principle are that religious liberty rights are not absolute. And that's because really no constitutional right or legal right can be absolute. And this is something that when you really get down into the weeds, like everyone has to agree with. Every legal right has to have limits. And I think one really important limit for religious liberty in particular is the Establishment Clause. As I said, the free exercise and the Establishment Clause ideally are supposed to work together. And so, part of religious liberty is that the government can't be so overly accommodating of one person's religious practice that it essentially veers into sponsoring or promoting a particular religious belief or values. Fifth, and this I think is a really kind of interesting one, religious liberty must be democratic. So many of the demands for religious exemptions that we're seeing now are, demands to essentially expand rights for already powerful interest groups. So groups that are already overrepresented in the democratic process, like for-profit corporate employers, large government contractors, and we're seeing, things like demands for religious exemptions from the right to unionize, the right to provide certain benefits to your workers, or, anti-discrimination laws. And so, we argue that, in most cases, we should be more concerned with the conscience rights of less powerful groups, people who are less represented in the democratic process. So, the rights of workers and consumers rather than of corporations, of the beneficiaries, the intended beneficiaries of government grants, rather than the folks getting government contracts. And then the final principle is that religious liberty must be pluralistic. And this, it comes back to, we've been kind of talking about this over and over again. We just need to stop conflating religion and religious liberty with just, the loudest voices in the room. And so, a piece of this means, taking a more rigorous look of how we should be protecting the religious liberty rights of minority communities, taking the rights of atheists seriously and including them as part of any sort of dialogue we're having on interfaith issues and religious liberty, and really pushing back against this notion that that the U.S. Has been or is now a Christian country.
Do you think there are any active steps that listeners of this podcast can take to contribute to the protection of religious liberty for all? I think so often, when we think about religious liberty, I find it sort of almost a sense of like determinism. Like this is something which is determined by the Supreme Court or legislators or people at the highest order levels of government. But is there any work to be done, do you think, in protecting religious liberty, particularly maybe for minorities, for those of us who are not engaged in sort of the legal world?
Yeah, what a good question. So I think in terms of one little thing that I think might be helpful is just, writing, pushing back. And when you see that conflation happen of religious liberty equals this, pushing back against that, whether it's, calling your local politicians and saying, I'm a person of faith and actually I support abortion rights, or I actually think that the religious liberty right that we should be talking about is immigration or environmentalism or native land rights or what have you. Also writing letters to the editor if you see an article in a newspaper that makes this conflation. I try to write a couple of these a week. We're saying, hey, I saw, thank you so much for writing about the Equality Act. I saw that you quoted 3 anti-LGBTQ pastors. I'd love to put you in touch with my rabbi who actually supports this and out of their deeply held, faith. I think that can actually be a really effective way to move the conversation. And it's really important. And I also think if you're active in your own religious congregation, another thing that could be interesting is I think that more progressive faith leaders may sometimes be hesitant to talk about some of these issues out of a completely understandable, concern about mixing religion and politics, or wanting to respect church-state separation, which I think is great and valuable. But I also think if the only folks talking about using the term religious liberty or talking about the importance of religious liberty are coming from these particular communities, we're not getting the whole picture. So, maybe having a religious community talk about what, religious liberty means to your faith group could be also another way to kind of move the conversation.
Liz, I think that about does it for us today. So thank you so much for talking to us about the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia. And we hope to hear from you soon. Thanks so much. You can find out more about the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at lawrightsreligion.law.columbia.edu. Interfaith Matters is hosted by me, AJ DeBonis. Our co-producer and editor is Michelle Polton-Simon, and our executive producer is Kevin Childress. Learn more about us on our website at interfaithmatters.org. As always, thanks for listening.